what's the sort of deep relationality that you can have with absolutely any element that's not you? Whether it's the tree I can look at outside my office, or whether it's being out in the wilds of Arizona or Utah or somewhere else, or the Arctic, right? How can you cultivate and create space for, and then actually reflect on what the meaning of that relationship becomes for you? And my hope is by doing that, even in the smallest way, that helps to shift slightly people's perspective. And it might shift the way that they engage in broader daily practices, or the way that they vote, or the way that they choose to conduct themselves in community. But I think it all starts with that relationality.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the social impact of conscious companies and everyday heroes. Hear inspiring stories from those who put people and planet before profit and personal gain. You'll learn how you can make a difference, vote with your dollars, and get involved today. Here's your host, Corinna Bellizzi.
Welcome to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for people like you who care about the future that we're building together. As of this episode, we've planted more than 22,000 trees through our partnership with forestplanet.org. This is one for every new subscriber and follower, whether you be on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and even our newsletter on caremorebebetter.com. So I invite all of you to follow us and join this journey. We are going to help reforest our future one tree at a time. Now, today, I'm honored to welcome a deeply thoughtful and visionary guest, Dr. Pavel Cenkl. Pavel is the Dean of Academic Affairs at Prescott College, where he leads innovative programs that blend ecology, philosophy, community engagement, and global learning. It also happens to be where I'm pursuing my PhD. His work is grounded in regenerative education, learning that restores both human and ecological systems. He's authored multiple books on landscape, culture, and pedagogy. Plus, he's the founder of regenlearning.org. This initiative advances distributed and resilient education networks around the globe. In today's conversation, we'll explore how we can reimagine education through the lens of regeneration, why networked global learning matters now more than ever, and what the future of higher education could and should look like. This is going to be a moving discussion over the course of the next several months as we all see what the fallout is from education cuts. Now, with that, I'd love for you to welcome with me Dr. Pavel Cenkl.
Thanks, Corinna. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'd love to begin with your personal why. What first drew you to this intersection of ecology, learning, and community?
Also, it's always an interesting question, like where do you start? Where does one's biography, start in an academic or professional context, right? And for me, there's very little space between the personal and the professional. I've spent a lot of time, growing up and, through my adulthood, in the outdoors, hiking, running, rock climbing, doing all of those sorts of things and finding different ways to engage with the more than human world. And there came a point as I was going through my master's and then my PhD programs that I thought, well, how can I transition from just doing these things in sort of what was really kind of a self-serving but really wonderful way, to experience these things firsthand and pivot slightly, and how to create opportunities for for others to engage, whether through building learning programs or thinking about sort of pedagogical engagements of the more than human world. Right. So I think it all has its essence in what is my personal and what is our personal relationship with the more than human world and with communities that are not ourselves.
And you've even run ultra marathons, right? Like 100-milers, things along those lines?
I have. And, as I get older, I'm trying to recognize that I might not be able to do that forever. But I'm still continuing that pursuit. And although I have run races, like the Leadville 100 was one of my favorite races, a 100-mile foot race in Leadville, Colorado. But largely, I've been interested in, doing sort of self-paced solo endurance events, largely in the Arctic or the subarctic, specifically in areas where climate change is really quite evident in its sort of impact on glacial and periglacial landscapes, on flora, on fauna, on indigenous communities, and so on. So, that's been a big part of my life over the last 15 years, really.
Yeah. When we interviewed on this podcast, John Waterman, who wrote Into the Thaw, he really shared some stark stories of the changes that he's seen in the last 20 plus years that he's been going into the Arctic and really the outland areas of Alaska. I feel like there's this resounding message of get out there while you can, because some of this landscape is forever changing and will be more difficult to navigate even the summer months.
Well, absolutely. And I think even bringing back those stories and those images, because the images of the Arctic and subarctic are absolutely gorgeous, right? And, many people don't have opportunities or, the accessibility to go to places like that. So to share, those firsthand experiences and then use that as an entry point to conversation about that's actually a manifestation of our impact here on the global climate. Right, to the impact that, in fact, like the Earth's crust is rising in Iceland to a measurable degree as a result of the glacial melt. So stories like that are really striking for people to hear and to sort of understand the connection between their engagement with the more than human world, or lack thereof, and then the global impact that has.
Now, as I spend time as a student at Prescott College, I feel like I'm getting to know more about this ethos of integration with more than human, integration with place. I'd love for you to talk for a moment about how Prescott College is really doing this work of experiential learning and how the institution has evolved and is evolving, perhaps in a more transformative way.
Yeah, well, I think involving and evolving are actually, that's a really interesting way to phrase that, right? Because we are constantly evolving, and we can talk about the larger sort of evolution of higher education and some of the challenges, the stark challenges that the higher education sector is facing currently. But also, I think involving, bringing into the fold sort of deeper conversations with the more than human and with communities that surround us. And a couple of days ago, I was giving a talk to the Chamber of Commerce here in Prescott, Arizona, and trying to describe for a very diverse non-academic audience what it is that Prescott College does. And I said, well, what we really do is we look at where the environment, communities, and action intersect. And I think that's fairly unique among small progressive liberal arts colleges, which is a unique sector in higher education now in its own right. So looking at ways that I sometimes describe it as practice-led rather than experiential, although experiential is the term that we use, where practice comes first, whether it's through a three-week orientation period where our incoming undergraduates spend 3 weeks out in the literal wilderness here in Arizona as a way to sort of frame what their practical engagement with the more than human world and with themselves as a community is going to look like over the course of their 4 years here at Prescott. And throughout our classes, and I think this is one interesting point of place of conversation, and it's a professional area of interest of mine, is how you manifest this not just with an on-campus cohort of students, but also with students who are distributed around the world and who may come to Prescott once, or they may not come to Prescott at all. They might go to one of our field campuses in Mexico or in Kenya, or one of our partner schools around the world. So how do you create opportunities for practice-led, embodied engagement with place and community for students who are remote learners, for example? And we've got some opportunities to do that, as I've already mentioned, some with field campuses and partner colleges and other sites that we can bring students to. But also it's creating a curriculum that gives opportunity to work with existing resources. Or we have a lot of students in the PhD program, such as yourself, who are professionals in a field who are already doing this work, and how to create the space to take what we're learning in the classroom as a cohort and put that into practice. And in fact, take that practice and bring that back to enrich the curriculum and the learning community.
I think we would be remiss if we didn't have a conversation, frankly, about the changes that are occurring and how we fund, how we put resources in the right places so that institutions like Prescott and even state schools can thrive and survive, given cuts to funding, cuts to what even students can borrow for their higher education, and really just the status of this present dismantling of the Department of Education, which seems to be in a spot where it's been given a temporary green light by our Supreme Court, right? Like, I guess do what you want is kind of the message that they've provided our executive office at this time. So what do you see happening? How can we adjust and move and perhaps become better at what it is that we're doing in order to ensure that students even have the resources that they need to come to a school, and that institutions like Prescott can not only survive this period, but really be prepared to emerge like a phoenix?
Absolutely. And we are pretty close to Phoenix, so I think that works out well. So I think you've asked a lot of questions packed into what you just said there. And one is, yes, the sort of recent changes, particularly I think what's happening in the Department of Education right now, the fact that it's losing, the bulk of its staffing, right? And colleagues who would actually assist students with accessibility, and, help learners actually meet the goals that universities are trying to help the students achieve, right? To create the workforce development that, in fact, is one of the monikers of even this administration, right? That education is for workforce development and skills development. And I think that's an absolutely draconian shift, that's happened quite suddenly over the last couple of weeks, right? We've seen sort of pointed attacks on higher education, ever since this new administration came into office. However, I'll say that this pathway that higher education has been on, this isn't new, right? So I've been involved in conversations and giving talks and writing about, the future of higher education and the higher education crisis for a number of years now, right? Recognizing that we've been in the midst of really an epidemic of college and university closures in the US, in the UK, where I've worked for 5 years, and elsewhere abroad, right? And largely these are smaller, progressive, liberal arts, often experientially focused institutions. Prescott College has served as a teach-out partner for a number of colleges that have closed in the United States, including recently Goddard College, Green Mountain College a few years ago, Quest University in British Columbia around that same time. And then there are others like Northland College in Wisconsin recently closed as well. And these are all sort of emblematic of sort of long-standing, often nearly 100-year-old institutions that were at the forefront of what progressive education means, that are no longer here. And the same is the case in the UK. And in fact, Schumacher College, where I was head of college for a number of years, lost its accreditation because of some political decisions in the charity that governed that institution. So that doesn't exist as a higher education institution at the moment either. And so these exemplary colleges and universities are finding it's a really hostile environment, even before this current administration, because of accessibility, continually increasing student fees, a bureaucratic landscape which, is one size fits all. I mean, we're accredited by the same regional accrediting agency that the University of Chicago is accredited by, for example, here at Prescott College, and we have a few students less than they do, and we don't have the staff necessarily to respond to the same level of bureaucracy that a larger institution might be. So I think there are some opportunities there on a number of different fronts, right? One, I came here a year and a half ago to Prescott, to start my position as Dean of Academic Affairs, specifically because I felt that Prescott and institutions like it are the vanguard of, or are at the vanguard of what higher education will become. Because I firmly believe, and have for a number of years now, that a monolithic institutional approach to higher education, a large institution that can do everything for everybody, isn't necessarily the sort of a future relational approach, a regenerative approach, or even a sustainable approach to education, where it's much more transactional, and it is upskilling and sort of creating skill sets for students and creating sort of accessible pathways. But I think what it's missing, and I think there's been a lot of criticism of higher education. In the news, we see a lot of back and forth between Washington and Harvard University, or Columbia University, or Princeton, or other sort of large-scale institutions that have long histories and large endowments, that they've become marginalized from the communities that they've meant to serve. And whether or not that's 100% accurate, I think there is a sense that because of their sort of perceived exclusivity, a lot of universities are separate from the institutions and from or separate from the communities that they're meant to serve, right? And I'd like to think that smaller, more nimble institutions, so Prescott has fewer than 900 students. I think we have 880 students at the moment. 120 or so are currently on campus here during the academic year. The rest of them are remote learners, such as yourself. And we have a huge role to play in engaging with the community that we're part of here in Prescott, Arizona, as well as with the communities where our remote colleagues are. And I can give a couple of examples of how we do that through experiential learning, for example. One great illustration that I use quite frequently is we have a creek that runs through the middle of campus called Butte Creek. So if listeners are unaware of what Prescott is like, we're at just over 5,000 feet of elevation in a very arid climate. We're quite higher than Phoenix, so we're not quite as hot, but still, it's a high desert environment. And so we have a creek that doesn't have water in it most of the time, but it's still a riparian zone. And it's one of the more biodiverse and bioabundant places in the community. We've had several years of grant-funded work and research to try to sort of reestablish native species, to eradicate invasive species. And in fact, it's now sort of a designated wildlife area. And we bring external partners that want to see how we're doing this and how can they replicate it in other parts of the country. We recently had a group from the Forestry and Firefighting Service come and see, how can we do this, or how can we help you or multiply the impact that you're having here. And that's right in the middle of a residential neighborhood here in Prescott, right? So we invite community members during Arbor Day to participate in this experiential learning, not in the framework of a classroom, but getting on the ground and doing stuff together. So I think that's one good example.
Now, I'd like to talk for a moment about accessibility as it comes into play in an education sphere. I would love to know how you define this, and if there are particular instances. I'm thinking, let's say, of testing scores and things like that. Let me give you some context first so that we can kind of explore this part of the discussion. I did the community college into a 4-year UC system school route, in particular because I had poor SAT scores. I had poor SAT scores because I'm a little bit slow when it comes to reading, and my math skills aren't great, so my nerves prevent me from doing as well as I could if I was given more time. And I think this is often the case for people who might be slow readers or something along those lines. They just will not perform as well. I literally didn't finish the English portion, and I still got something like a 70%. So, that's just to tell you kind of where you fall on a scale, right? But my test score was low, even though I had good grades and a nice essay and all this other stuff, right? So I did community college first and then transferred into a 4-year school. Well, I was intimidated by the prospect of then going to take a GRE because I test poorly, even though I perform well in academic settings and professional settings. So, I didn't want to go and take the GRE. I was so intimidated by it, in fact, that I just put off graduate school. And by the time that I was looking at, do I want to get a master's? The last math class I'd been in was so many years ago that I was even more fearful of what it would take for me to take this test, like a GRE or a GMAT, depending on what I wanted to do, right? Well, now I learn that even these really reputable institutions, including Stanford, put on pause a lot of these requirements that they might otherwise have for certain graduate programs, and for many of them, especially during the period of COVID. They really haven't restarted that. They haven't said, we need your test score to be X in order to come in. It really seemed to be more that if you had a professor advocate within the institution, you'd be pretty likely to be able to get in, even to something like Stanford. That if your research was in a particular arena that they are focused on, again, you'd be more likely to be able to succeed in that arena because they have more slots available, so to speak. And they're focused on, let's say, coming through with more published research because that's really their focus, right? So you get to be, a little slave in their labs to publish as much research as possible and add more credibility to the institution year upon year. Well, someone who doesn't come from education may not, like I did not, know that it was possible to even get into some of these schools on a waiver. I ended up going to pursue my MBA when my undergraduate degree was 20 years in the past. Okay. I graduated in 1998 from UC Santa Cruz with honors in the major, having only been there for 2 years, which people told me wouldn't be possible, but I did it anyway, right? And then I now apply to go to Santa Clara University. I attend on a waiver, thinking, okay, well, I'll have enough math basics to get me through, right? To then learn that I had to learn calculus. Now, what is my ability to test in a setting like, how did you do on your SAT? How did you do on your GRE? Well, guess what? I had to be thrown into calculus-based classes, and I still graduated at the top of my class. So again, I can perform in an academic setting. I just do not take standardized tests well. And I've never been able to get over that hurdle. I doubt that would have changed by now. And I think people don't necessarily understand that even some policies around something as simple as test taking can really be an accessibility issue. Like even giving a student more time to take a statistics exam so they can pass statistics and then go through to fulfill their other general education requirements, as opposed to just being blocked. I worry that some of these moves by the education department could potentially put more hurdles in place so that more students are unable to succeed. So now I've talked way too much. The floor is yours.
No, I think that context is really important, Corinna. And earlier I'm scribbling notes here, as we're having the conversation, right? And I put down skill because I think there's I've been thinking recently about how do we define what skill is, and how do we measure on the other end of it, right? How do we measure the outcomes that we hope our students leave the institution with? And those things are also being changed and sort of being imposed upon us as institutions, right? One of the sort of only and principal metrics that we're being assessed by as an institution is how much our graduates make, how much they earn per year after they graduate, right? And so I'm really interested in what are alternative metrics, or what's a more holistic way of doing that sort of assessment? Because something like that, and I think it will work backwards to your question, right? But something like that suggests, well, your ecological impact or your community engagement or your sort of social responsibility or your ethical or moral responsibility are not important as outcomes. The only importance in the outcome is how much you make per year, because that then creates a tax base and helps to support, you're a cog in the machine, as you suggested, right? That researchers might be. So I'm really interested in how we can find leverage points to be able to enhance what those metrics are, so we can be sort of more holistically assessed as an institution and as a sector. Like, what's the purpose of higher education? Yes, it's people come to get a degree so that they can have a good livelihood and they can have a good job or be entrepreneurs and create a job for themselves and have a comfortable life. Absolutely. What else though? Like, how do we support students who want to you can say give back to, but it's really engage in a more regenerative process with the human and the more than human world in my terms, right? And I think that's what is core to Prescott College. So our students don't necessarily earn as much as some other institution might. However, I think the metrics that we would use for those students is, oh yeah, you're having a much more ecologically integrated livelihood, or you're giving back to the community, you're engaging with a diversity of communities.
What's your job satisfaction? What's your life satisfaction?
What's your satisfaction? Yeah, exactly.
Where do you sit on a happiness scale?
Right, and I think some of that, Corinna, goes back to your question about sort of entry points, right? Which is, we don't require those exams, and I'm not a big fan of any sort of testing, because I think assessment and sort of evaluation, such as it were, of students, or how do you help students meet a particular standard, learning outcomes in a course or program learning outcomes in a program. I think we have all sorts of ways that we can help students meet those standards, because we are in that framework of higher education, right? But there was an interesting conversation recently that I was part of about, how do we define, in the face of these changes of national standards, and with the Department of Ed in the US and so on, like, how do we actually change what the skills are that, in fact, critical thinking or a liberal arts approach or ecological engagement are really skills that we can reframe some of what I describe as transdisciplinary, holistic, progressive education. And those words sometimes mean absolutely nothing to a potential employer, right? But they have this list of skills that they're looking for their new employees to have. But in fact, those skills are embedded in what we do. So it's a matter of framing what we do to actually meet the expectations that are being imposed upon us. So if we need to play that game, and we do, it's how do we reframe and sort of reshape what we do without changing it at all, but just to be able to speak the language of a sort of different framework of accreditation, a different framework of expectation. So sort of redefining what a skill is can be one really interesting way into that.
Well, I mean, even going to an institution that has similar values to those of Prescott, like I gravitated to UC Santa Cruz because at the time that I attended in the mid to late 90s, they really didn't offer every course for a grade. It was evaluations, right? Now, I knew at the same time that I likely wanted to pursue a graduate degree. And in particular, I was interested in archaeology. I wanted to be an archaeologist. No, that's not what I do today. So the dreams of a 22-year-old can shift, right? But I really was focused on that. It was important to me. And because of that, I felt like I absolutely had to get honors in the major. I had to put my everything and my all into it just so that I would be, perceived to be a quality student. I did archaeology digs in France and in Central California, so much work in the realm of extracurricular activities focused on the area of study that I was focused on. I also became fluent in French because you had to have one foreign language fluent, and it was recommended for the area of study that I was looking at for it to be either French or German. I wanted to study Neanderthal. German sounded really harsh to me, so I studied French. At any rate, don't regret a second of that extra effort I put in. Feel like I learned a lot. I'm grateful for the relationships I built along the way. I'm grateful for the experience of being an American in a small town in France for a couple months and having that in the field learning in a completely different capacity than anything in the classroom could ever teach you. So I'm absolutely an advocate for this perspective of transformational learning and transformational leadership learning, because it's through experiences like this that you really test your strength and test your ability to adjust to different situations. And I think that that's a lot of what hiring managers are looking for when they're looking for skilled employees. They're looking for people that have that emotional intelligence, that have the awareness of understanding what it takes to kind of carry something through to the finish line, of doing more than what's asked at minimum. And I think that's really what they're looking for when they look at your academic performance. So how do we transform that way of thinking so that even, a student that might have been in my seat at a fairly progressive institution feels like they have the leg up that they need on the other side while we're rebuilding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's gets back to the fundamental question that I grapple with, right? What does the future of higher education look like? And I was just in a webinar earlier today where they shared a statistic that over the last 5 years, the number of employers who no longer list a degree as a requisite for a position has increased from 60% to 70%. Now, I can't vouch for those statistics, but it was, a webinar I attended that said, well, so there's definitely an increase in employers who are looking for skill sets rather than degrees. Or at least that's what they're saying on their job ads, right? So for me, that's really interesting, because does that mean that there is, and we've seen this in public discourse, right, a sort of waning trust or faith in the BA or the MA or even the PhD and what that means? And is that because we've done a poor job in higher education of actually articulating what that means, and what skills a degree in adventure education or in sustainability education or a degree in anything means, and how is that currency in the world outside of academia? And I think the answer is yes, we have done a really bad job at doing that. And I think now a lot of institutions, I think Prescott's among them, are playing a bit of catch up, right? How we can demonstrate that we've been doing this for 60 years here, and we've had a tremendous local community impact, regional impact, in Kenya and Mexico and all sorts of places, and on tens of thousands of students over the years. But how do we articulate that in this moment, right? So when I talk to, again, like the Chamber of Commerce, business leaders from the area, I have a huge list of, here are alumni started businesses in the community, everything from, bookstores and restaurants to people that work as firefighters and nurses and first responders and teachers and, contractors and developers and realtors, and basically a cross section of the community. And then I pause and say, well, what makes our students different, or our graduates different? And I think it is that sort of sense of, I'm engaging with the community, with the ecological systems, the more than human world, and I'm doing that through practical experience. And that's really what drives our students and drives our alumni. And I think that's what differentiates Prescott from a lot of other institutions, whether it's online or on-campus learning. Another answer to your question, though, is about accessibility. We're poised to launch a suite of micro-credential programs, coming this autumn, which I'm not going to call it the Prescott micro-credentialing program, because I think that again, that's academia speak for certificates or badges or short-term immersive engagements in a particular skill set, and that might be to upskill yourself in a particular area of rock climbing that you're interested in, or it might mean an immersive week to talk about an introduction to regenerative ranching, which is one of the ones that we're looking at, or it might be looking at a particular dance movement or proficiency in dance if you're interested in moving up in that field. And these are all active partnerships that we're working with as examples. So to create more accessible, lower risk, lower cost, and sort of shorter duration, more accessible programming, I think is definitely on our horizon. And then you can stack a lot of those credentials together to help move you toward a potential degree if that's of interest.
Yeah, well, I think you're speaking to the underlying issue, and that's the education costs in our society presently. The reality is people often go away to colleges, and when they go away to colleges, they also have to pay for their cost of living, and they're not staying at home. They don't have kind of these same safety nets in place. So it has started to feel, I think, for many people, like it's out of reach. And then when you are also confronted with restrictions and what can be funded and by how much, I mean, I can't tell you how many posts I've seen in social media of students in their third year of medical school who are suddenly saying, I can't take out another loan. I therefore can't pay next semester's tuition. Like, I'm basically screwed. And they didn't use this, they used the F word, right? I'm going to try to keep it nice right now. But that reality is staring people in the face. I've seen trends in social media of young people coming up and saying things like, oh, you don't have to buy a degree, as if you just hand over cash and you get a degree in response. That's not what the education system is. I wish I'd have the ability to go away to a 4-year school from day one to day, however many days that was. I simply couldn't afford it, and I had a challenge getting into the school I wanted to because of the fact that my test scores were so low. Sorry that was the case, but the reality is, that's the case for a lot of people. They don't meet a minimum threshold in some capacity, and sometimes it's just paying the bill, and you'd like to think that if you can't pay the bill, you can get into the school and you can get funding, but that is being proven time and again to just not be true, that enough resources are not available. There are extenuating circumstances that hit any number of us. In my case, when I was going to school, my father was going through a divorce, so his funds were locked up. Life gets in the way, right? I wouldn't really go back and change any of it, aside from one thing. And that is just that growing up underprivileged, because I grew up poor, right? And growing up without that kind of faith in my ability to test meant that I self-limited for much of my early life. And the message I would like to provide everyone with who hears this podcast is that these these self-defeating thoughts that enter our psyche don't belong there. We should not claim them. We should not own them. And we should seek to find a space where we feel that we can excel. And what I love about Prescott College is that you've created an environment for people where they can find a path that's different than you might see in a more traditional four-year school, and that allows people to play into their strengths and pursue a different sort of education, one that is more rooted in experiential learning, one that is more rooted in transformational thinking. And if I'd been able to allow myself that kind of thinking when I was in my 20s, who knows where I'd be today? Maybe the same place, who knows? I doubt it. I mean, you shift where you are based on what you learn along the way. And that's just reality for us. So I wonder if you have personal experiences or thoughts to share just along those lines. And if you could share what your vision is of the future of education, both at Prescott and beyond.
Yeah. So again, you've packed lots of questions into that one, Corinna. And I appreciate that, right? Because again, I came to Prescott having been familiar or certainly aware of the college for about 20 years. I taught previously at Sterling College in Northern Vermont. I was there for about 13, 15 years, 14 years, as various flavors of dean as well, right? And what struck me both there and then at Schumacher College, where I was head of college for 4.5 years, and then here, they're very similar institutions in terms of the community is at the core, right? And I think this is one of the pieces that has drawn me to these types of colleges. And I don't think I could work at a larger institution because, in my experience, having gone to, Northeastern University for my PhD, which had, I don't know how many tens of thousands of students at the time. And I never met anybody outside the English department, which was really small. What was my degree? That was my degree. And then I went to University of New Hampshire for my master's, another school with thousands and thousands of students in it. So I think I was seeking something personally, right, where I knew everybody's name. And we could, in some instances, all of us literally sit in a circle, and look at one another and talk about the issues of the day. And certainly in the case of Sterling and Schumacher, food and growing our food and cooking it together and eating it together, was a core element of that community. And it's part of what we do here at Prescott. And I'd like to build that back a bit as we increase our undergraduate enrollment. To grow the food that we consume and to spend some time together around that as a way to celebrate being together. It's something we all do anyway, and more often than not, I'm eating lunch here in my office, and I'd much rather be sitting with students and having fresh produce from our gardens, that sort of thing. So I think that it's a living and learning community more so than a sort of transactional institution where, yes, you are coming here for a degree, you're coming here to take courses, you're coming here to learn things, but you're also coming here to learn how to be in community. And whether that's residential or, our community of remote learners, where we might get together, at Keno Bay, where we had a PhD student retreat last year that I attended, or we might get together for, an interdisciplinary experience at the Depoi Center in Kenya. I was able to join the 20th anniversary celebrations there last year. So I think all of these are, that there is a sort of a cost barrier to some of those experiences, right? But less so if you're here on campus or if you're in one of our partner institutions, or we're trying to make these these experiences as accessible as possible by looking at our tuition fees, by looking at what sort of grant funding outside of the federal pathways might be available for our students to participate in this, and it is the little things, like when we grow food here through our Sustainable Food Systems undergraduate certificate program. We don't necessarily use it as actively in our on-campus cafe, but we give it to the students at no cost, to cook in their residence halls, and we share that even with some of the students from Embry-Riddle University, who we have a few of them who live in our residence halls as well, right? So I think it is, again, building community around food in that way, right? And community has to be part of what the future of higher education is. And so to get into the second part of your question, I've done a lot of work. I think you mentioned the regenerative learning network piece that I'm also a part of. And that's something that I began in my work when I was at Schumacher College in England, thinking about, how can we sort of leverage our role as a small progressive, institution in a much larger global network of sort of different bioregions coming together, different expertise coming together, and different opportunities to actually help shape our narratives around climate change, around social injustice, around global conflict, around other things, around economic transformation. I was fortunate. Schumacher College was in the town of Totnes, which is in the county of Devon, in the southwest of England, and Totnes was a transition town. Right. So, you might have heard of sort of transition towns. So towns that are in transition from sort of a more standard economic and ecological and community model to a more progressive one. And we can all identify what utopia looks like and what our aspirations are and how we want to get there. But most of us, almost all of us, are somewhere on the trajectory, on the pathway to trying to get there, or trying to help communities achieve a more sustainable, more regenerative framework. So we're always in transition. So the town itself sort of doubled down on that and said, how can we sort of manifest what it's like to be in transition? And so working with colleagues there, Rob Hopkins is from there, and he's written a number of books about this. And a number of our faculty were engaged with that same sort of mechanism of how can we help students not just sort of be aspirational, but do the work of moving us in a distributed way by sort of sharing collaboratively across the network, in relationship with community, in collaboration with, different sectors. So looking at the nonprofit NGO sector, the, for-profit, small to medium-sized enterprise sector, and then higher education and schools and et cetera, and how we all have to work together as a holistic part of community. I think, if there's anything that I'm trying to get across here, it's, higher education can't be separate from the world. And I think Prescott has doubled down on that over the last 60 years. Like, Southwest is our classroom. And I think even more, the globe is our classroom, like the world and our partnerships and our connections.
Now, you've written about the head, heart, and hands model. Is that connected to this line of thinking?
It absolutely is, yeah. And we used that. Satish Kumar, who was the founder of Schumacher College, in 1991, he had a background as a former Jain monk in India, and sort of famously walked on foot to all of the nuclear powers. I think it was in the 1960s. To the nuclear capitals of the world, and tried to advocate for against proliferation of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and built upon that experience to say, all right, I want to build a learning opportunity institution and college for students to come and explore what it's like to not just think intellectually about things, but think in an embodied way, as was his focus, right? So merging the sort of intellectual academic thought with the embodied practice, with the sort of soulfulness or spirituality that brought those together. So really the head, the heart, and the hands. So work was an integrated element into what we did. And interestingly, at Sterling College, which was actually one of the federally recognized work colleges in the US, students working, every student had a job. Every student was engaged in daily, embodied practice in work, whether it's in the admissions office or on the farm or anywhere else, as part of their academic curriculum. At Schumacher, all of the students, whether they were master's students in economics or design, they worked on the farm, and to help, cultivate and weed and harvest the food that then we would eat later in the year. And I see similar things happening here on a different scale, like in the Butte Creek Restoration or the Sustainable Food System Certificate Program, or other ways that students are engaging practically, in labor, in work, right, as a core element of their experience. So the embodied practice is really core at all three of those institutions.
Now, I had another question I written down before we got our start today, and I think This connects to your earlier share around this idea that on the other side of your educational journey, you should earn X, or that the outcome should be Y or Z, right? Is this specifically when you talk about the dangers of extractive education? Is that what you're speaking to? And could you also share what it means to move forward into a more reciprocal learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think extractive, transactional, sort of siloed, isolated, marginalized, like they're not synonyms, but all of those to me fall under the same umbrella. Uh, and extractive can be when we pull knowledge from a particular cultural group and use it in external to that context. And been a lot of criticism of research over the years that does exactly that thing. And we need to be cautious of doing that. And extractive as well, of having experiences, whether it's rock climbing or rafting or even gardening, right? You're literally extracting that experience from the place that you're in. And by not recognizing, for example, whose land that has been over centuries and millennia, what's the history that's layered into the landscapes that you're having this transformative experience in, that becomes you're just using that landscape for your own selfish benefit in some ways, right? So there's a lot of sort of extraction. That's I can see across the higher education or education curriculum generally. And I'd like to think that through Prescott's relational approach, where we're actually building collaboratively, parts of the curriculum, we are working with community partners, we're working with hand in hand with the more than human world, that becomes much more relational and integrative than an extractive process would be. And I can give you an example that if we've got time. Happy to give you an example from my work with the UN Development Program that I've been engaged with for about 3 years now. And now Prescott College is a partner with the UNDP Conscious Food Systems Alliance. And our Transformative Food Systems master's degree, for example, speaks directly to what it means to integrate consciousness and sort of active, sort of mindful thinking into food systems transformation. And over the last couple of years, I've worked with colleagues across 5 continents and learning centers, in South America and Africa and Southeast Asia and North America and Europe, right, to build a distributed curriculum around transformative food systems and consciousness. And that has been a 2-year process to build a 6-month curricular program, because it was built from the ground up by learning centers in different parts of the world, from different cultural contexts, different economic frameworks, different ecologies, different languages. And really it was, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't as though, Schumacher or Prescott College are coming in to build this. In fact, it was an equitable exchange of knowledge and experience across this network that now we're poised to run as a pilot, hopefully within the next year or two. So I think building curriculum in a collaborative way like that is actually the definition of regeneration.
I love that. Now, I wanted to offer you the floor to share perhaps a thought or an idea or a practice from today's conversation that listeners can walk away with as their seed of knowledge for the day. What do you hope that might be?
Yeah, well, I can give an example that I think speaks exactly to that, right? So I moved to England just before COVID. And so one of my first acts at Schumacher College was to close the campus, unfortunately, and then work remotely and have about an hour to spend outside. That's what the UK government said we had. And during that time, I was reflecting on all of my, Arctic, running experiences and all of that sort of stuff, being, or endurance athletics in remote places. And that I was doing the opposite of that. I thought, well, how can I make that accessible to people who might be doing what I'm doing, which is stuck inside except for an hour a day? And how far can you get, and how can you build a similar relationship with the more than human world by not and not going out for weeks on end into the Arctic, which is certainly not accessible and an incredibly privileged thing to do. But what if you could just go and visit with the tree in your garden, or visit with the hedgerow down your lane? And how can you build a human, more than human relationship with that place and that thing? And so we built a master's program around that concept called Movement, Mind, and Ecology. And so in that, the core element was, how do you inhabit the alive space between the human and the more than human? And so I often invite students, when they allow me in the classroom, which is unfortunately not very often, I invite students to find ways that they can inhabit that space, right? What's the sort of deep relationality that you can have with absolutely any element that's not you, right? Whether it's the tree I can look at outside my office, or whether it's being out in the wilds of Arizona or Utah or somewhere else, or the Arctic, right? How can you cultivate and create space for, and then actually reflect on what the meaning of that relationship becomes for you? And my hope is, by doing that, even in the smallest way, that helps to shift slightly people's perspective. And it might shift the way that they, engage in broader daily practices, or the way that they vote, or the way that they, choose to conduct themselves in community. But I think it all starts with that relationality.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, for your thoughtful work and for this inspiring conversation. Your work is not only reshaping education, it's helping us imagine a more just, a more regenerative, a more interconnected world. So to all of those listening and watching, if this conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to check out Pavel's work at regenlearning.org and follow Prescott College's initiatives in global, ecological, and community-based learning. I am going to share the several episodes that I've hosted for different leaders from Prescott College on this podcast. They're professors from a variety of different areas of study. And really, it's just been my privilege and my honor to be involved in the institution. I am thrilled to be a Prescott College Sustainability Education PhD student. And hopefully by the end of next summer, you can call me Doctor too.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, Corinna. I really appreciate the time, and I'm really happy to have you as part of our community.
Yeah, thank you so much. And listeners, I want to invite you all, of course, to visit those earlier episodes, give me feedback. And if there's any questions that you have about the institution for myself or for Pavel, please always feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for your time today, Pavel.
Thank you.
What an immense honor and privilege. I want to remind everyone not to forget to follow Care More Be Better wherever you listen, and join our email list at caremorebebetter.com. Every new subscriber does mean another tree planted. Together, we can rethink this system of education. We can regenerate our ecologies. We can care more, and we can be better. So until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep learning with the land, with the more than human realm. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Care More, Be Better, a podcast for social good. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and share with your friends to help us reach more people and spread more social good.